Lawyers, what's the craziest WTF moment you've seen in court? Story 1. I was defending a guy in a petty theft case, shoplifting a pack of batteries from a hardware store. The prosecutor was acting smug, saying their star witness was going to seal the deal. The witness was the store's head of security, a guy in his 50s who had clearly been through hundreds of cases. He got up there, swore in, and started talking about the incident. Only he started mentioning details that didn't match the date in question. When the judge asked him to clarify, he suddenly admitted that he might be thinking of another time. Turns out, he had mixed up 3 different incidents in his head, and none of them were the defendant. The judge dismissed the case on the spot, but the best part? The security guy, embarrassed, blurted out, "Well, he steals a lot, so I assumed this was him." The judge leaned forward and said, "We don't convict people on assumptions in this courtroom." Story 2. I was second chair for a medical malpractice defense. The plaintiff's attorney had been hammering our client, a surgeon, for hours about surgical notes supposedly proving negligence. Then the plaintiff takes the stand and says, "I still have the sutures they left inside me. I keep them in a jar." Everyone's jaws dropped. The judge allowed them to show it, and the plaintiff's lawyer confidently handed the jar to the bailiff. The bailiff looks inside and says, "This is a shoelace." Everyone leans in. It was literally a dirty, frayed shoelace in murky liquid. The plaintiff insisted it came from inside their abdomen. Our expert testified it was physically impossible for that to be a surgical suture, and the judge called a recess because she was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes. The case evaporated. Story 3. During a property dispute trial, the opposing counsel put their client on the stand to testify about exclusive use of a shared driveway. Their big argument was that my client had blocked them from using it for years. The witness was very convincing. Until, on cross, I asked if they had any proof. They confidently pulled out their phone to show photos of my client's car blocking the driveway. Problem: they forgot they had synced their phone to display on the court's monitor. Before the clerk could turn it off, everyone in the room saw not just the photos, but the date stamps clearly showing they were taken 2 days ago during the trial. The judge sighed and said, "That's not years. That's 48 hours. The jury didn't take long. Story 4. I was prosecuting a fraud case involving forged checks. The defendant swore under oath they had never even seen the bank in question and that the signature on the checks wasn't even close to theirs. Then, as the checks were being passed to the judge, one slipped out of the stack and landed on the table in front of the defendant. Without thinking, they picked it up and said, "This one's from when I was in Florida." Everyone froze. The defense lawyer literally closed their eyes and muttered, "Oh no." I asked, "So you have seen this check before?" Silence. Then they tried to say they meant a different check, but the damage was done. Story 5. In a divorce case, the husband was claiming he was broke and couldn't afford spousal support. He came to court in a wrinkled shirt, carrying an old backpack, looking every bit the struggling man. On cross, the wife's attorney asked if he had any assets. "No," he said. Then she asked if he had traveled recently. "No." She pulled out a stack of Instagram screenshots from 2 weeks prior, him on a yacht in the Maldives wearing a Rolex with champagne in hand. He stammered, "That was a friend's boat." She flipped to another screenshot, him holding the yacht's keys with the caption, "My baby." The courtroom was dead silent for a moment before the judge said, "We're going to revisit your financial disclosures." The spousal support order doubled. Story 6. I was assisting on a criminal defense case where my client was accused of assaulting a man outside a bar. The prosecution's key piece of evidence was CCTV footage, except they only had a short clip showing a man in a hoodie throwing a punch. In court, the prosecutor played the clip dramatically, saying, "This is the defendant." Then, on cross, I asked to see the uncut footage. They hesitated, but the judge allowed it. The full video clearly showed my client standing 20 feet away during the altercation, and the person throwing the punch was wearing shoes with neon stripes. My client pointed down to his black dress shoes in court and said, "I've never even owned those." The prosecutor's face turned crimson, and the judge dismissed the charge within the hour. Story 7. I was in court for a will contest where a brother and sister were fighting over their late mother's estate. The sister claimed her brother had coerced their mother into signing a new will that left him everything. Her proof was an audio recording she claimed was from the night the will was signed. She pressed play in court, and we all heard a heated argument. But in the background, a TV was playing. The opposing counsel asked the judge to pause the recording, then asked the sister if she knew what show that was. She said no. He then pulled up Netflix on his laptop and played an episode of the same show, released 2 years after their mother had died. The sister went pale. The judge stopped the trial and referred her for possible perjury charges. Story 8. I was prosecuting a burglary case where the defendant swore they were nowhere near the victim's house the night of the crime. On cross, I asked if they owned a certain jacket, a very distinctive bright orange one with a huge eagle emblem. They denied it. I then called in a surprise witness, a pizza delivery driver, who had taken a selfie with the defendant that night because they thought the jacket was hilarious. The timestamp on the selfie matched the exact time of the burglary, and the victim's house was visible in the background through the open door. The jury actually laughed out loud when they saw it. The defendant just sat there staring at the floor. Story 9. I once sat in on a hearing where a man was trying to sue a small auto shop for ruining his car. He claimed they had replaced his brake pads with cheap, unsafe parts that nearly caused an accident. The shop owner brought in their mechanic, who calmly explained every step of the repair. Then he asked if he could show the court something. He walked outside, came back in holding the brake pads they'd removed, except they were completely worn down to metal and had manufacturer stamps from 10 years prior. The mechanic said, "These are the same ones we replaced. You still have them because we found them in your trunk this morning." The plaintiff tried to say he didn't know they were there. The judge tossed the case in less than 5 minutes. Story 10. I was involved in a civil fraud trial where the defendant's main argument was that the incriminating emails were fabricated. Their IT expert testified that the emails didn't exist on the company server. On cross, I asked the expert if they had checked the defendant's personal email accounts. They said, "That's outside the scope." The judge ordered them to produce the accounts. The next day, the defense lawyer looked like they hadn't slept. The emails were all there, including one where the defendant literally typed, "Let's keep this off the official system so no one can find it." The courtroom went silent, and then the judge leaned back and said, "Well, they found it." The jury didn't need much convincing after that. Story 11. I was observing a murder trial where the defense claimed their client couldn't possibly have been at the scene because they were at home, sick in bed, the entire night. The prosecution seemed unbothered, and we quickly learned why. In the middle of cross-examination, the prosecutor handed the defendant a series of printouts, screenshots from a dating app. It turned out the defendant had been sending flirty messages and selfies from the victim's neighborhood at the exact time of the murder. The kicker? One of the selfies accidentally caught the victim's house in the background, visible through a window behind them. The defendant froze, stammered, and then said, "That could be anywhere." The jury audibly scoffed. Story 12. I once worked a civil case where a landlord was suing a tenant for extensive damage to an apartment. He claimed the tenant had left the place uninhabitable, with holes in the walls and broken fixtures. His before photos looked pristine, and his after photos looked like a war zone. On cross, the tenant's lawyer asked for the original image files. After some wrangling, the landlord's attorney reluctantly provided them. The tenant's lawyer pulled them up on a laptop and pointed to the metadata. The after photos had been taken 2 years before the tenant had even moved in. You could feel the tension shift in the room. The judge asked if the landlord wanted to reconsider pursuing the case, and he quietly withdrew his lawsuit on the spot. Story 13. In a high-stakes corporate theft case, the defense's strategy was to attack the chain of custody for the physical evidence, specifically a USB drive containing stolen trade secrets. The defense lawyer grilled the forensic expert, trying to create doubt about whether the drive had been tampered with. On redirect, the prosecutor casually asked the expert if they could read one of the innocuous files aloud to the court. The expert opened a text file and read the first line. Can't believe we pulled this off. Deleting everything tomorrow. Defendant's name. The defense lawyer stood up and objected, but the judge just raised an eyebrow and said, "Objection overruled. Please continue reading." You could see the jury leaning in like they were watching a TV drama. Story 14. I was clerking during a divorce trial that had already turned ugly. The husband was accusing the wife of hiding marital assets, specifically a rare coin collection worth tens of thousands. She denied knowing where it was. Mid-testimony, the husband's lawyer handed her a printed screenshot of her own Facebook Marketplace listing. The coins, photographed on her kitchen counter, posted under her account just 2 weeks prior. The room went dead silent. She tried to say it was just for a friend, but the profile photo, username, and even the reflection of her in the counter's glossy surface told another story. The judge didn't say a word for a full 30 seconds, then simply said, "Counsel, please proceed." Story 15. During a personal injury case, the plaintiff was claiming they couldn't walk without a cane due to a workplace accident. They hobbled into court dramatically, leaning on the cane the entire time. On cross, the defense lawyer asked about their daily activities, and the plaintiff swore they were basically housebound. The lawyer then played a video on a large screen, security footage from a local bowling alley taken the previous weekend. It showed the plaintiff laughing, carrying a pitcher of beer, and bowling multiple strikes without any assistance or limp. The plaintiff tried to claim it was an old video until the defense froze the frame and pointed to a giant banner in the background reading Summer League 2023. The jury's faces said it all. Story 16. I was shadowing a federal trial involving an art fraud ring. The defendant claimed they'd never touched the supposedly stolen painting in their life. Their defense leaned heavily on no physical evidence. Midway through cross-examination, the prosecutor asked the defendant to identify a signature on the back of the canvas. Without thinking, they said, "That's my handwriting." You could hear the collective inhale from the jury box. The prosecutor just stood there, silent, until the defendant tried to backpedal, claiming they meant it looked like their handwriting. The judge actually paused the proceedings so the stenographer could read the quote back verbatim. The rest of the trial felt like watching a slow-motion train wreck for the defense. Story 17. I once sat through a child custody hearing where the father insisted the mother was mentally unstable and should not have unsupervised visitation. His attorney presented pages of text messages supposedly from her, threatening harm and making erratic statements. The mother's attorney calmly asked if she could see the phone they came from. The father smugly handed it over. She scrolled for less than a minute before asking the judge if she could plug it into the courtroom monitor. Every single threat had been sent from the father's own number to a cheap prepaid phone saved in his contacts under the mother's name. He had been texting himself for months. The judge looked like he wanted to throw the phone out the window. Story 18. In a commercial real estate dispute, the seller claimed the buyer had defaulted on payments and refused to vacate the building. Their proof was a series of bank statements showing missed rent deposits. On cross, the buyer's attorney asked how they'd obtained those statements. The seller confidently said the bank sent them. The attorney then produced a letter from the bank's legal department stating they had never released such statements, and that the account numbers didn't even exist. The seller's face drained of color. When the judge pressed further, the seller admitted he'd made examples in Photoshop to illustrate the point. The judge called for a recess, but it was clear the case had just imploded. Story 19. I was in a criminal trial where the defendant swore they were nowhere near the scene of an armed robbery. The prosecution presented a grainy convenience store video that, while showing a similar build, didn't clearly show a face. The defense seemed confident they could use that to their advantage until the prosecutor called their surprise witness, the getaway driver. He walked in, looked the defendant dead in the eye, and said, "Yeah, that's him, and he still owes me gas money." The courtroom erupted in muffled laughter, and the judge had to threaten to clear the gallery. The jury's demeanor shifted instantly, from skepticism to certainty. Story 20. During a malpractice trial, a surgeon was accused of performing an unauthorized procedure. He adamantly denied it, claiming the patient must have misunderstood the consent forms. The patient's attorney brought in the hospital's OR logs, and right in the middle of the records, under procedure notes, was a single sentence in the surgeon's own handwriting. Patient asked about X, decided to just do it while in there. The surgeon tried to say it was just a note to myself, but the judge's glare could have melted steel. The jury foreperson was shaking their head before the witness even stepped down. Story 21. I was in court for a high-profile arson case. The defendants swore they were miles away at a family barbecue when the building caught fire. Their alibi was supported by multiple family members. During cross-examination, the prosecutor calmly placed a charred GoPro on the evidence table. It had been found in the remains of the burned building. They plugged it in, and to everyone's surprise, it still worked. The video showed the fire starting from a first-person perspective, complete with the defendant's reflection in a shop window and their voice saying, "We'll light it from here." The entire courtroom went silent, except for the defendant muttering, "That's not me," while wearing the exact same jacket in the video. Story 22. In a fraud trial involving a fake charity, the founder claimed every donation went directly to helping children. The prosecution pulled bank statements showing large transfers to personal accounts, but the defense argued it was for reimbursing expenses. Then came the twist. The prosecution brought in a surprise witness, the founder's travel agent. She testified with receipts that the expenses included a 2-week luxury cruise, designer shopping sprees in Milan, and a gambling trip to Macau. The judge asked the defendant to explain the child benefit of a $12,000 roulette loss. The defendant stammered something about networking opportunities. You could see the jury exchanging looks like they'd just heard the dumbest excuse in history. Story 23. I was assisting on a personal injury case where the plaintiff claimed a defective chair collapsed under them at a cafe, causing severe back injuries. They brought in the actual chair as evidence, still wobbly and broken. On cross, the defense attorney asked the plaintiff to demonstrate how they'd sat in it. The plaintiff gingerly lowered themselves onto it in front of the jury. The problem? The defense had already swapped in a sturdier, identical chair earlier that morning, and it held their weight perfectly. The attorney revealed the switch and pointed out that the broken chair had, in fact, been broken after the alleged injury, as proven by surveillance footage from the cafe. The plaintiff's case crumbled in minutes. Story 24. During a contract dispute over a botched construction project, the contractor claimed the building's electrical issues weren't his fault, blaming faulty plans from the architect. His credibility seemed solid until the architect's lawyer handed him a printed email. It was an exchange between the contractor and his foreman, casually discussing cutting corners on wiring to save time and bragging, "They'll never know until the lights start flickering." The contractor tried to say it was just a joke, but when asked why he sent it right after getting paid in full, he had no answer. The jury didn't buy the humor defense for a second. Story 25. I sat in on a case where a man was accused of forging signatures to gain control over his elderly aunt's property. His main defense was that he never even met the notary whose stamp was on the documents. The prosecutor called the notary to the stand. She walked in, looked directly at the defendant, and said, "Hi, honey," before waving cheerfully. She then testified they had been dating for 6 months at the time and that she'd done him a favor. The defendant's attorney put his head in his hands while the defendant blurted, "We broke up years ago. She's just mad at me now." The judge said dryly, "Well, she's mad, and she's sworn in." The jury looked like they'd already made up their minds. Story 26. I was observing a trial where a contractor was being sued for taking full payment for a home remodel, but never starting the work. His defense was that the homeowner had changed their mind and refused to let him on the property. Midway through testimony, the homeowner's lawyer rolled in a TV and played drone footage taken by a neighbor over the span of 3 months. It showed the contractor coming and going from the property, unloading expensive tools, and working on his own truck in the driveway instead of the house. You could see him under the hood, welding and painting, while the house sat untouched. When the judge asked why he used the property for personal projects, the contractor said, "I needed a safe space to work." That answer did not help his case. Story 27. In a criminal trial for armed robbery, the defendant swore they'd been playing in a local basketball league at the exact time of the crime. Their lawyer even had a blurry team photo from that night as proof. On cross, the prosecutor asked for the original digital file. After pulling it up on the big screen, they zoomed in on a clock in the background. It showed a completely different day and time. Then they pointed out that the scoreboard displayed the name of a team that hadn't existed for 2 years. The defendant's alibi collapsed instantly, and the jurors gave each other that, "Are you kidding me?" look. Story 28. I was shadowing a high-dollar divorce case where the husband claimed he was broke after paying off debts and therefore couldn't split assets. His financial records looked squeaky clean until the wife's lawyer subpoenaed records from a luxury auction house. Turns out, just weeks before filing for divorce, he'd bought a vintage sports car worth $450,000 and registered it in his brother's name. The lawyer presented glossy photos from the auction of him standing next to the car, grinning ear to ear. The husband tried to say, "I was just holding it for my brother." The judge deadpanned, "Do you also plan to hold on to the insurance and maintenance bills for him?" Story 29. During a wrongful termination lawsuit, the plaintiff claimed they were fired for whistleblowing about illegal activity. The employer insisted it was due to chronic tardiness. The plaintiff presented perfect attendance logs to prove punctuality. On cross, the defense asked about their social media use. The plaintiff admitted they were active online. So the defense pulled up dozens of public morning posts time-stamped between 9:10 and 9:45 a.m., all tagged "at work," despite their shift starting at 9 o'clock. In one post, they even wrote, "Boss is already mad, I'm late again, LOL." The jury chuckled, and the plaintiff's attorney didn't ask any more questions. Story 30. I sat in on a theft trial involving a rare guitar stolen from a music shop. The defendant insisted they would never steal because they don't even play guitar. The prosecutor rolled in the shop's security footage, which everyone had already seen. The defendant slipping the guitar case out the back door. But then they played the follow-up footage from the next night. The defendant in the same shop, after hours, playing the exact stolen guitar and singing into the shop's microphone. The defendant yelled, "That's just me trying it out." The judge leaned forward and asked, "In the middle of the night, after breaking in?" The courtroom burst into laughter. Story 31. I was in a criminal trial for identity theft. The defendant swore under oath that they had never even seen the victim's credit card, let alone used it. Their defense was going smoothly until the prosecutor pulled out a receipt from a luxury boutique. On the receipt, next to the purchase description, was a handwritten note, "Hold for pickup." Defendant's name. The boutique's manager took the stand and testified that the defendant had come in wearing the same leather jacket they were wearing in court that day, signed for the purchase, and even asked for gift wrapping. When confronted, the defendant tried to claim it was a different person with the same name, but the jury didn't look convinced, especially after the manager pointed out the exact same scar on the defendant's hand. Story 32. I once observed a workplace harassment lawsuit where the accused boss swore they had no idea what the plaintiff was talking about and had never interacted inappropriately with any staff. The plaintiff's lawyer asked if the boss used messaging apps. He admitted he did, but claimed it was all work-related. Then came the hammer. The lawyer had subpoenaed the boss's WhatsApp backups from his phone provider. Projected onto the court's big screen were weeks of messages to the plaintiff, including one sent at 2 a.m. that read, "Can't stop thinking about you? Don't tell HR." The boss's lawyer visibly deflated in their seat. The boss muttered something about jokes, but nobody in the room was laughing. Story 33. In a probate case, a nephew contested his aunt's will, claiming she was too ill to make rational decisions when she signed it. His lawyer painted a picture of her as bedridden and incoherent. On cross, the opposing counsel asked if he had visited her much in her final months. He admitted to visiting a few times, Then they played a video, filmed by the aunt herself just 2 days before she signed the will, where she looked perfectly healthy, dancing in her kitchen, and sarcastically saying into the camera, "Don't worry, I'm too sick to know what I'm doing." The jurors actually laughed, and the nephew's case never recovered. Story 34. I was watching a criminal trial for illegal firearms possession. The defendant swore the gun found in their trunk wasn't theirs, and that they had no idea it was there. The prosecutor asked if they owned any gun accessories. The defendant said no. Then, from an evidence bag, the prosecutor pulled out a custom leather holster with the defendant's initials embossed in gold. The kicker? The holster was an exact fit for the seized gun. The defendant tried to say it was just a gift, but the prosecution produced a social media post from 2 weeks earlier, a mirror selfie of the defendant wearing the holster, gun, and all, with the caption, "My new baby." That was the moment you could almost see the jury check the guilty box in their minds. Story 35. During a breach of contract trial, a wedding photographer was being sued for losing the pictures from a $50,000 celebrity wedding. She claimed the memory cards had been stolen from her car. The plaintiffs were devastated and demanded damages. Midway through cross, the plaintiff's lawyer asked if she had ever shared any of the photos online. She insisted no. Then the lawyer pulled up her professional Instagram, which had just been set to private that morning, and showed multiple shots from the wedding posted months earlier, watermarked with her business logo. The photographer blurted, "Those were just backups." The judge raised an eyebrow and said, "Backups you claimed were stolen?" That single exchange essentially decided the case. Story 36. I was sitting in on a federal embezzlement trial where the defendant, a nonprofit treasurer, swore every cent they withdrew from the organization's account went to community programs. Their lawyer kept showing neatly organized spreadsheets, complete with itemized expenses for youth events, food drives, and school supplies. On cross, the prosecutor asked about a single $18,000 charge listed as educational conference. The defendant smiled and said it was a leadership seminar for staff. The prosecutor then played a slideshow of photos pulled from the defendant's public Facebook. The so-called conference was actually a week-long vacation at a Caribbean resort, featuring beach cocktails, jet skis, and a casino. The defendant tried to say some sessions were by the pool, but the jury didn't buy it. Story 37. In a landlord-tenant dispute, the landlord was suing for massive property damage, allegedly caused by the tenants throwing wild parties. The landlord's main evidence was a series of security camera clips showing dozens of people entering the building. On cross, the tenant's lawyer asked for the raw footage. When it was played in full, the first few minutes showed the landlord himself unlocking the door and ushering the partygoers inside, because it was his own birthday celebration. The lawyer then pointed out that the supposed damage photos were time-stamped the day after the party, and clearly showed a cake with "Happy 50th Dan" sitting on the counter. Dan was the landlord. Story 38. I observed a medical negligence trial where the surgeon claimed they had followed every protocol and never deviated from standard procedure. The patient's lawyer handed the surgeon a copy of the hospital's official surgery notes, which included every staff member's initials for each step completed. Right in the middle of the list, next to a skipped safety check, was the surgeon's own signature, with a big arrow and the handwritten words, "Too busy, skip this." The surgeon tried to explain it was sarcasm directed at a nurse, but the nurse was in court and testified that it was absolutely serious. The jurors' expressions said the case was over right there. Story 39. In a copyright infringement case, the defendant insisted they had never seen the plaintiff's artwork before creating their own. The plaintiff's attorney calmly asked the defendant to open their laptop, which the court had ordered preserved in its exact state. As the screen lit up, the default browser page loaded, and the very first tab was still open to the plaintiff's art portfolio. It had been sitting there for over a year. The defendant stammered something about inspiration and research, but when the attorney clicked through, there was a folder on the desktop labeled Art "I'm stealing." The judge actually rubbed his temples before telling the stenographer to make sure that last part was in the transcript verbatim. Story 40. I watched a hit-and-run case where the driver swore they'd been home all night and that someone else must have been driving their car. Their lawyer even produced a neighbor who claimed to have seen the car parked in the driveway during the time of the incident. The prosecutor asked to play the city traffic camera footage. It showed the driver's car speeding through an intersection right after the crash, with a massive inflatable Santa still strapped to the roof from holiday decorating. The defense tried to argue anyone could have strapped that on, but the prosecutor then pulled up a video from the driver's own TikTok posted earlier that day, them laughing about driving around with Santa on top. The jury didn't need a second look. Story 41. I was in a corporate espionage trial where the defendant, a former employee, swore they had never taken any files when they left the company. They said they walked out with nothing but their personal effects. During cross, the prosecutor asked if they used cloud storage. The defendant said no. The prosecutor then projected an email from the defendant to their personal Gmail account with the subject line, "All files backup." Attached was a zip file containing the entire client database, sent the night before they resigned. The defendant tried to argue that it was just for safekeeping in case the company lost the data. The judge asked, "And why would they need safekeeping from you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Story 42. In a civil suit over a botched landscaping project, the homeowner claimed the contractor had planted the wrong trees and refused to replace them. The contractor swore the homeowner had personally approved the species. On cross, the homeowner's attorney pulled up text messages between the two. The contractor had sent a photo of a completely different tree type, and the homeowner had replied, "Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted." Then the attorney zoomed in on the metadata of the photo. It was taken in another state 3 years earlier and wasn't even from the contractor's current nursery. The jury's faces went from curious to disgusted in seconds. Story 43. I sat through a high-profile art forgery case where the accused forger claimed the painting they sold was a family heirloom. They spun a long, emotional story about it being passed down through generations. The prosecution wheeled in the actual canvas and asked a museum curator to examine it in court. Within minutes, the curator pointed to the back of the frame and peeled off a barcode sticker from an art supply store, dated less than 6 months prior. The defendant's jaw literally dropped. The prosecutor quipped, "Quite the heirloom, considering it was still on aisle 7 this spring." The judge had to ask the gallery to stop laughing. Story 44. In a personal injury case, the plaintiff claimed permanent hearing loss after a workplace accident. They said they couldn't hear anything above a whisper and had to rely on lip reading. During cross-examination, the defense attorney accidentally dropped a heavy binder behind them with a loud crash. The plaintiff whipped their head around instantly. The attorney asked, "You heard that?" The plaintiff froze. The defense then presented an audio recording from a week earlier of the plaintiff singing karaoke at a bar, perfectly on key. When asked how they could sing in tune without hearing, the plaintiff just said, "I can feel the vibrations." No one in the courtroom seemed convinced. Story 45. I watched a forgery trial involving checks stolen from a small business. The accused swore they had never seen the checks before and couldn't even write in cursive properly. On cross, the prosecutor handed them a sheet of paper and asked them to write a random sentence. The handwriting matched perfectly to the forged checks. The defense tried to argue it was just similar. But then the prosecutor asked the defendant to sign their own name. It was identical to the signature on the stolen checks, down to a distinctive flourish on the Y. The jurors exchanged looks that basically said, "Game over." Story 46. I was observing a customs fraud trial where the importer swore they'd never smuggled anything and that all shipments were fully declared. The defense leaned heavily on clean-looking invoices. During cross, the prosecutor wheeled in one of the actual seized crates, still sealed from the port. They opened it in front of the jury. Inside were neatly stacked boxes labeled as ceramic plates. The prosecutor opened one, revealing not plates, but high-end electronics wrapped in newspaper. The defendant immediately blurted out, "That's not the shipment I packed." The prosecutor calmly held up a packing slip taped inside the box with the defendant's own signature and date. Story 47. In a defamation case, a small-town mayor was suing a blogger for claiming he'd taken bribes. The mayor testified he'd never accepted a cent from anyone in exchange for political favors. The defense attorney then produced a series of Venmo screenshots, each with public notes like, "Thanks for pushing that permit through," and "For your help with the zoning change." The amounts ranged from $500 to $2,000. The mayor tried to claim they were just jokes between friends, but one payment had a note reading, "This bribe is totally not a bribe." The judge's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. Story 48. I was in a patent infringement trial where the defendants swore they'd developed their product entirely in-house and had never seen the plaintiff's prototype. The plaintiff's lawyer asked to see the defendant's design sketches. Reluctantly, they handed them over. Halfway through the stack, the lawyer stopped and held up one sheet. It still had the plaintiff's watermark faintly visible underneath the erased pencil marks. The defendant tried to say they'd bought the paper secondhand, but the watermark matched a confidential draft the plaintiff had never released publicly. The jury visibly stiffened, and the defendant's lawyer suddenly looked like they regretted asking for a trial. Story 49. In a case over a disputed lottery win, the man who claimed the ticket was his swore he had bought it at a gas station and kept it safely at home until redeeming it. The other claimant insisted they had purchased it and lost it that same day. The judge allowed surveillance footage from the store, and it showed the eventual winner picking the ticket up off the floor near the register, looking around, then quickly stuffing it into his pocket. When confronted, he said, "I was just picking up trash." The prosecutor deadpanned, "And you kept that trash until it won $2 million? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Story 50. I witnessed a federal corruption trial where a city contractor swore under oath that he had never spoken to the official accused of steering him lucrative projects. The prosecutor then played a wiretapped phone call between the two, laughing about how they'd split the bonus and joking about meeting somewhere without cameras. The defendant's lawyer tried to claim the voice wasn't his, until the prosecutor played another recording from a different day where he clearly said, "This is full name," right before discussing the same scheme. You could see the jurors' expressions change instantly from curious to absolutely certain. Story 51. I was in a high-profile jewel theft trial where the defendant claimed they'd never even been inside the jewelry store. Their lawyer pushed hard on the lack of fingerprints or DNA. The prosecution waited until the second week of trial to pull out their trump card, a photo from the store's own Instagram account. It was a group shot of customers during a holiday event, posted months before the theft, and there, dead center, was the defendant, smiling and holding up the exact necklace that would later be stolen. The caption even read, "Trying on our one-of-a-kind diamond piece." The defense tried to say it was photoshopped, but the store owner testified the photo was taken by their own marketing team. Story 52. In a wrongful death civil suit, the defendant, a nightclub owner, claimed their security staff had no involvement in an altercation that led to a patron's death. They insisted the victim had been escorted out peacefully. The plaintiff's lawyer rolled in security footage, but not from the club, from a taco stand across the street. It showed the bouncers dragging the victim by the arms, throwing them onto the sidewalk, and one of them kicking the victim as they tried to stand. The nightclub owner's face went completely blank. When the judge asked why the club's own footage didn't show this, the owner admitted those cameras weren't working that night. The jury didn't need convincing. Story 53. I watched a fraud case involving a charity telethon organizer accused of pocketing donations. The defense argued there was no proof of theft, only sloppy accounting. On cross, the prosecutor produced a live recording from the event. During a commercial break, the cameras accidentally kept rolling. The defendant could be seen stuffing cash into a backpack and telling a volunteer, "Don't worry, I'll square this later." The defense tried to claim he was just securing the funds, But the prosecutor followed up by showing ATM footage of him depositing that same cash into his personal account less than an hour later. Story 54. In a construction defect case, the builder claimed the collapsing deck wasn't their fault because they followed the approved blueprints exactly. The homeowner's lawyer brought in an engineering expert who pointed to a key support beam that was completely missing. The builder said it wasn't necessary. Then the lawyer produced the original signed blueprints, with the missing beam circled in red and initialed by the builder himself. The defense went silent, and the judge dryly remarked, "Looks pretty necessary from here." The jury nodded along. Story 55. I attended a trial where a man was accused of assaulting someone in a road rage incident. He claimed he never got out of his car and drove straight home after the argument. The prosecutor called the victim's teenage son as a witness. The boy took the stand, opened his phone, and played a TikTok he'd recorded during the fight. It clearly showed the defendant exiting his car, shoving the victim, and screaming threats. In the background, his license plate was visible the entire time. The defendant tried to argue the video was deep-faked, but the judge asked, "Do you think this 14-year-old has a Hollywood effects budget?" The courtroom laughed, and the jury looked ready to vote. Story 56. I was in a banking fraud trial where the defendant swore they had no access to the victim's accounts and couldn't even log in if they tried. Their attorney painted them as completely tech illiterate. On cross, the prosecutor rolled in a large screen and projected a live capture from the defendant's own laptop, which had been seized under warrant. The bookmarks bar was filled with saved logins to the victim's accounts, and the autofill fields instantly populated the username and password when the prosecutor clicked Log In. The defendant tried to say, "I don't know how that got there," but the prosecutor then clicked the browser history, showing dozens of visits to the accounts in the weeks leading up to the theft. The defense didn't recover from that. Story 57. In a product liability case, a major appliance manufacturer insisted a faulty washing machine couldn't possibly cause fires the way the plaintiff described. They brought in engineers to testify it was physically impossible. On cross, the plaintiff's lawyer asked to play a short clip from the plaintiff's home security camera. The footage showed the washer shaking violently before a burst of flames erupted from the control panel. The defense still tried to argue it was tampered with, but the lawyer then pulled out the fire department's incident report, which listed the cause as electrical failure originating in washing machine model exact model. The jury's eyes went wide, and the defense team looked like they wanted to vanish. Story 58. I sat through a federal drug trafficking trial where the defendant claimed the police planted the drugs in his car. He testified he'd never transported anything illegal. The prosecution played dash cam footage from the arrest, nothing unusual at first, until the defendant himself could be seen on the recording nervously muttering, "Hope they don't find the stuff in the trunk," as the officers approached. He tried to claim he was joking, but the prosecutor followed up with body cam footage showing him frantically kicking a duffel bag under the back seat during the stop. The jurors didn't need to hear much more. Story 59. In a multi-million-dollar contract dispute, the defendant's CEO claimed they had never agreed to the deal in question and that the signature on the contract was forged. The plaintiff's lawyer calmly called in a handwriting expert who gave a detailed analysis confirming the signature was genuine. The CEO still denied it until the lawyer projected an internal company training video onto the screen. In the video, recorded months earlier, the CEO was giving a pep talk to employees and literally held up the signed contract, saying, "This is the deal that's going to change our future." The room went silent except for a few gasps from the jury box. Story 60. I witnessed a civil theft case where a museum claimed a rare historical document had been stolen by a visiting researcher. The defendant testified they'd left the archives empty-handed and that the document was probably misplaced. Midway through trial, the museum's lawyer asked the judge to allow a search of the defendant's personal storage unit, which had been sealed by court order. The doors were rolled up in front of everyone, and there, in a climate-controlled box, was the missing document, along with a dozen other items reported stolen from different institutions. The defendant's lawyer immediately asked for a recess, but the judge just said, "We're done here." Story 61. I was in a high-stakes corporate theft trial where the CFO swore he had never moved company money into his own accounts. His attorney emphasized that there was no proof of a direct transfer. On cross, the prosecutor brought out a series of international bank statements showing wire transfers from the company's main account to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under the CFO's middle name. The CFO insisted it was someone else with the same name. The prosecutor then pulled up a security video from a Cayman bank branch showing the CFO himself walking in and withdrawing $50,000 in cash while wearing the same Rolex he had on in court. The jury didn't even try to hide their disbelief.